Before the chaos and the smoke, Maple Ridge Estates looked like perfection carved out of a catalog. White fences, trimmed lawns, and smiles that lasted only as long as someone was watching. I'd moved here 8 years earlier, believing rules meant peace, not control. My yard was my refuge. A small workshop, a smoker, and a neatly stacked pile of oak I split every fall. There was truth in the rhythm of chopping wood, the clean swing of the axe, the scent of sap and effort. Then she arrived, Karen Whitmore, mid-40s, dark chestnut hair pulled into a flawless bun, a pale tailored suit that never creased, pearl earrings gleaming like punctuation marks to every command. Clipboard in hand, she walked the streets like she owned the weather. Within a month, she crowned herself HOA president. No one remembered voting, yet her word was law. She measured grass blades, photographed mailboxes, and called it maintaining standards. That word soon became our cage. Her first visit to my porch came with a smile sharp enough to cut glass. She told me my woodpile violated community aesthetics. I pointed out it sat behind the shed, invisible from the road, but she claimed symmetry mattered more than reason. 10 days to move it, she said. I didn't. I simply stacked it straighter and went back to work. That should have ended it, but Karen treated defiance like gasoline. Soon, pieces of wood began vanishing, 20 at first, then a dozen every other night. At first, I blamed forgetfulness, maybe the landscapers. But each time I counted, the numbers fell. I carved small notches into the ends, my craftsman's signature, and set a motion light by the shed. That night, it flared. A shadow in heels crossed my yard. By dawn, 4 marked logs were gone, and I knew exactly whose perfume lingered in the cold air. I tried reason first. Her letters arrived anyway. Official warnings printed in neat fonts, signed President Whitmore. According to her, my firewood endangered neighborhood harmony. The hypocrisy was almost poetic, because through her grand front window, I saw those same notched logs burning in her fireplace, glowing like evidence. Anger pulsed under my ribs, but I didn't knock. People like Karen fed on outrage. Silence starved them. Instead, I smiled to myself and made a promise. She wanted my firewood? She could have it, just not the way she expected. That night, I opened my old drafting pad, brushed off the dust of forgotten projects, and sketched the blueprint for something educational, a harmless reminder disguised as revenge, equal parts mischief and mechanics. For the first time in months, I slept soundly, soothed by the quiet hum of invention. Morning brought a clear sky and the calm patience of planning. I gathered tools, oak scraps, bits of leftover black powder from 4th of July experiments, and hollowed a few logs with my lathe. They looked perfectly ordinary, bark-patched and ash-dusted. Inside, each held a pinch of fireworks powder, nothing deadly, just loud enough to teach humility. I stacked them among the real ones, hidden like secrets in plain sight. Step 1, identify your Karen. Step 2, let her steal. Step 3, let physics deliver justice. I installed discrete cameras above the shed and the gate, their lenses camouflaged in shadow. Then I waited, days stretching thin, heart thudding each time motion alerts flashed. When her beige coat finally crossed the screen again, calm as ever, loading my logs into her SUV, I almost admired her consistency. Almost. The footage was flawless. Her smug reflection in moonlight, the quiet theft caught from 2 angles. I saved copies everywhere. Still, I kept silent. Experience had taught me that arrogance is its own trap. A few days later, during an HOA meeting, she began lecturing about unsafe wood storage, announcing fines against me while sipping from a mug labeled "Number 1 Boss Lady." The irony nearly made me laugh aloud. I let her finish, then mentioned calmly that half my wood had been stolen. Eyes turned. I said I had video evidence. The room froze, her smile cracking like paint. She stormed out, leaving whispers behind her like falling leaves. That was the moment the neighborhood began to wake up, realizing their tyrant could bleed embarrassment. The following days felt lighter, quieter, but I knew silence was only her regrouping. True to form, another envelope arrived, this time fining me for unauthorized security devices visible from public areas. I laughed so hard coffee splashed my notes. She wanted a war of rules. I had one final experiment left. In my workshop's glow, I whispered, "Let's make your next fireplace unforgettable." Engineers see the world in levers and cause and effect, and Karen was just another equation. By nightfall, my setup was ready. 3 hollow logs perfectly disguised among the pile. The next theft would complete the formula. And right on cue, her flashlight sliced through the dark again, steady and titled. She took the bait, every single one. I leaned back, watching the live feed, and whispered, "Fuse lit." The explosion came 2 nights later, a dull boom that rattled the cul-de-sac. I stepped outside into a breeze tinged with smoke and the faintest sweetness of oak and irony. Karen's perfect wreath hung half-burned on her blackened door. Her hair stood wild with static. She was yelling at firefighters, insisting her purchased wood combusted spontaneously. I almost pitied her performance until she slipped, saying she hadn't bought it at all. Neighbors turned to me, realization dawning. Even the firefighters bit back grins. I kept my expression neutral, hands folded behind my back, the calm of a man watching his design perform perfectly. When Mrs. Beasley whispered, "Karen, did you really?" the rest of the sentence drowned in laughter. That night I toasted the stars from my porch, the faint orange glow still pulsing behind her curtains. The group chat erupted by dawn. Rumors, theories, emojis of flames. I typed, "Hope everyone's safe," feigning innocence. By noon, the fire inspector stood outside her home with 2 HOA board members. Karen emerged in oversized sunglasses, voice trembling between outrage and denial. The inspector concluded the logs contained firework residue, harmless but volatile. She immediately accused me of planting them. I sipped coffee and reminded her gently that she'd already admitted where her firewood came from. The crowd gasped. Her argument collapsed like wet ash. There's a special satisfaction in seeing arrogance implode without lifting a finger. By afternoon, the whole neighborhood had gathered near her driveway, curiosity drawn like moths to scandal. Karen's voice trembled between fury and panic as the inspector quietly photographed the debris. I stood a few feet away, pretending disinterest, while every eye flicked between us. When the official mentioned reactive compounds likely from fireworks, her face drained of color. Then came the accusation. She declared I had booby-trapped the logs. The crowd stiffened. I calmly reminded everyone that she herself had confessed to taking them. The inspector raised an eyebrow. Even Mrs. Beasley sighed. Karen's protest dissolved into stammers. A single child giggled somewhere behind the group, the tension cracking like brittle wood. For once, her power was ash in the wind. I simply turned, finished my coffee, and left her to choke on her own smoke. The following morning, the air buzzed with gossip. Headlines in our community feed screamed, "Fireplace Fiasco!" Screenshots of soot-streaked Karen spread faster than the flames had. I told myself to stay detached, but schadenfreude tastes a lot like victory. For 3 days, the street stayed unnaturally calm. No new memos, no warnings, no ruler-wielding patrols. Then an envelope appeared on my door, a summons to a special HOA hearing citing community endangerment and unauthorized surveillance. I laughed so hard the cat jumped. She was staging one last performance, desperate to reclaim control. I gathered everything: videos, the inspector's report, messages proving the explosion originated in her chimney. By Thursday night, I was ready. The beige clubhouse where she once lectured us now waited to host its grand finale. The room buzzed with whispers when I entered. Every chair filled. Even neighbors who'd skipped years of meetings came for the show. Karen sat at the head of the table, immaculate again, pretending confidence behind layers of makeup. She opened the session with a speech dripping in accusation, describing me as reckless, vindictive, dangerous. When she finally paused, I thanked her for the drama and opened my folder. Piece by piece, I laid out the evidence: the inspector's statement, the time-stamped footage, screenshots from the community chat. The video froze on her face mid-theft, illuminated by moonlight. Gasps rippled through the crowd. She claimed it was fake, doctored, harassment. I reminded her Officer Ramirez had already reviewed it. Silence fell heavy as oak. Then laughter, soft, then spreading, broke the spell. The meeting turned from spectacle to reckoning. One by one, board members spoke, cautious at first, then firm. Even Mrs. Beasley found her courage, reminding Karen of fines for wind chimes and Halloween lights. The crowd applauded. Karen's mask cracked. Her voice rose, brittle with desperation. She claimed without her, the neighborhood would collapse. Wilson, the quiet vice president, adjusted his glasses and called for an emergency vote. Hands lifted across the room, dozens, then nearly all. Motion passed. Karen's reign ended not with fire, but with democracy. She stood trembling, muttering threats about lawyers and conspiracies, then stormed out. The door slammed. The echo felt like thunder fading into freedom. Applause erupted. For the first time, Maple Ridge felt alive. In the weeks that followed, peace returned like spring after drought. The new board scrapped petty rules, invited input, hosted gatherings instead of hearings. Neighbors laughed again. Even the air seemed lighter without her presence pressing on it. Rumors said she'd moved 2 towns over, another HOA to conquer, another board to terrorize. I wished them luck. At night, I'd sit by my rebuilt fire pit, flames dancing where vengeance once burned. The memory of her explosion still made me grin, but it wasn't anger anymore. It was released. Funny how justice can roar like a detonation, yet leave behind such quiet. I lifted my glass toward the embers and whispered a toast to balance, to patience, to perfectly timed science. Months passed. Our street transformed into what it was always meant to be, a place of laughter, not lectures. Kids raced bikes again. Old Mr. Jenkins planted roses without measuring their height. Each weekend, neighbors gathered around my fire pit, swapping stories about the great wood heist. Even newcomers knew the legend, retelling it like folklore, the night arrogance met engineering. Sometimes I'd catch myself staring toward her empty house, wondering if she ever understood. Maybe she did. Maybe the fire burned more than her chimney. Maybe it scorched her certainty. Maple Ridge finally exhaled. The night skies felt bigger, freer. I realized revenge had never been the point. It was about reclaiming peace she'd stolen, one log at a time. Autumn returned, crisp and forgiving. A new couple bought Karen's house, cheerful retirees who filled the yard with sunflowers instead of surveillance cameras. They invited everyone to brunch, proof that the curse had lifted. When I arrived with a basket of real firewood, the husband grinned. "You're the guy from the story." I laughed. "Depends which version you heard." He raised a beer. "To standing up to nonsense." I clinked bottles with him, feeling that rare satisfaction of cycles closing cleanly. Later, sitting alone by the fire, I thought about Karen. Not with anger, but clarity. Control had consumed her. Order turned to obsession. Power to parody. In the end, all she'd taught us was the simplest truth. Communities thrive on respect, not fear. One chilly evening, as I tightened a bolt on my smoker, a voice startled me. It was her, Karen, standing at my gate, smaller now, wrapped in scarf and hesitation. She said she'd come to collect decorations left behind. I walked her to the shed. She looked around quietly, eyes softer than I remembered. "You've made it nicer," she murmured. "Easier when no one's measuring fence shadows," I replied. She smiled faintly, the kind that carried apology without words. Before leaving, she paused. "They call me HOA Karen online." I shrugged. "Internet's undefeated." She nodded, turned, and walked away without a fight. For the first time, she looked human. Maybe humility is the final explosion, the quiet kind that rebuilds. That night, the neighborhood gathered once more, firelight flickering across familiar faces. Wilson raised his glass, to peace, to courage, to every person who stopped being afraid. Laughter rolled through the dark like wind through leaves. I watched the sparks rise, tiny stars breaking free, and felt something close to grace. Revenge hadn't restored balance, truth had. Respect, once suffocated, had found oxygen again. As the embers glowed, I thought of the lesson hidden in all that smoke. Never mistake control for strength. Real power is calm, steady, earned. Karen's story ended in fire. Ours began in light. When I finally went inside, I glanced back one last time. The coals pulsed gently, like a heartbeat. Home at last. Days turned into weeks, and peace lingered like the soft hum of a distant melody. Maple Ridge felt alive again, gardens blooming, laughter echoing where lectures once reigned. Sometimes I'd catch faint traces of smoke from someone's barbecue and remember the night that changed everything. The story spread far beyond our little suburb. Friends sent me links to online forums where strangers debated whether I was a genius or a menace. I didn't mind either label. What mattered was the silence that followed, the quiet earned, not imposed. Karen became folklore, a warning wrapped in neighborhood myth. And me? I kept stacking wood, real wood this time. Each log split clean, honest, safe. The crack of the axe sounded like punctuation at the end of chaos. Winter came early that year, crisp mornings dusting roofs with frost. I'd walk the cul-de-sac, coffee steaming in hand, nodding at neighbors who now met my eyes without fear. Sometimes they'd joke about checking their chimneys, and we'd laugh, easy and unguarded. The HOA ran smoothly under Wilson. Fair, transparent, almost boring, which was perfect. I caught myself thinking about Karen less and less until she became a shadow fading with the snowmelt. Yet some nights I'd glance at the faint scorch marks near her old mailbox, still etched into the pavement, and smile. It wasn't guilt or pride, just memory. Proof that sometimes justice doesn't arrive in uniform or court papers. Sometimes it crackles in a fireplace and teaches lessons louder than words ever could. By spring, the neighborhood had reinvented itself completely. We held barbecues, movie nights, even a small fair around the community pond. Children laughed where once whispers filled the air. One afternoon, Wilson handed me a framed photo of the new board smiling under a banner that read, "Maple Ridge Reborn." He said it was for the man who reminded them that silence is surrender. I didn't feel like a hero, just someone who'd stopped running from nonsense. I hung it in my workshop above the new woodpile, the one stacked perfectly even but visible from the street. No one complained. Sometimes I'd stand there watching the sunlight trace along the grain and think how ironic it was that firewood, the thing that caused so much chaos, had finally become a symbol of peace. And yet, every story leaves embers. Late one night, I was closing my shed when a faint knock echoed from the gate. No one stood there, just an envelope pinned to the post. Inside, a single note written in neat cursive. "You were right. K." No signature, no address. I read it twice, feeling that strange mix of closure and nostalgia. Maybe she'd learned something after all, maybe not. I tossed the paper into the fire pit and watched it curl into nothing. Above me, the stars burned cold and clear. The neighborhood slept peacefully, fences gleaming under moonlight. I whispered to the flames one last time, not in anger, but gratitude, for teaching me patience, precision, and the art of poetic justice. The fire hissed softly, as if agreeing. If there's a lesson buried beneath all that ash, it's this. Control disguised as order is just fear wearing lipstick. Karen thought she was protecting us from chaos, but she was really building her own. People like her don't listen to reason. They need impact, noise, a mirror held up to their pride. That's what the explosion was. A reflection, a loud, smoky truth that rules without respect always burn themselves out. Now, when new residents ask about the Firewood incident, I tell them it was a science experiment gone right. They laugh, not realizing that in some ways it was exactly that. In every community, balance is fragile, but once found, it glows steady, warm, earned, alive. Maple Ridge finally learned how to breathe. Spring melted into summer, and Maple Ridge found its rhythm again. Saturday mornings smelled like fresh coffee and cut grass, not anxiety and enforcement letters. Kids splashed in sprinklers, neighbors lingered by driveways, laughing about nothing. I became the unofficial handyman of the block, fixing fences, tuning grills, even repairing Mrs. Beasley's porch light. The same woman who once measured lawns now baked cookies for everyone. Funny how quickly fear evaporates when the tyrant leaves. Sometimes I'd still catch a whiff of smoke from someone's chimney and feel a spark of memory. The pop, the shock, the look on Karen's face when her perfect order went up in flames. Not satisfaction exactly, but justice. Pure, balanced, inevitable. The neighborhood had learned to breathe again, and I'd learned to let go. But peace, I've learned, doesn't erase curiosity. One evening, Wilson stopped by holding a newspaper. "Thought you'd want to see this," he said. On the front page, an article from another county. Local HOA president resigns after financial scandal. The photo showed a familiar smirk trying to look dignified behind sunglasses. Karen. Different town, same chaos. I felt no anger, no joy, just inevitability. Some people never change, they simply relocate their storm. Wilson shook his head. "You think she'll ever stop?" I smiled. "Not until she runs out of neighborhoods." We both laughed, but there was something almost sad about it. You can't fix what won't admit it's broken. Still, knowing she was someone else's problem now made the sunset feel warmer than ever. A few weeks later, Maple Ridge hosted its first official summer festival, something Karen had banned for being too noisy. Booths lined the street, grills smoked, and laughter replaced years of whispering resentment. I ran the build-your-own birdhouse stall with leftover workshop scraps. Kids hammered crooked nails, proud of every wobbling masterpiece. When the fireworks started, Mrs. Miller nudged me and joked, "Don't tell me you packed the logs again." I laughed until I cried. The night sky burst into color, harmless explosions lighting faces with joy instead of fear. Maybe that's what redemption looks like. Not silence, but celebration. For the first time, I wasn't the man from the Firewood story. I was just Tom, the neighbor who helped fix a broken street. And that felt right. Time moved gently after that. Seasons folded over each other, calm and predictable. I built a small bench beside my fire pit where people would stop to talk or share a drink. The scorch marks on the pavement faded, grass grew over them, but the story lingered, passed down like a cautionary legend. Sometimes newcomers would ask if it was true. I'd smile and say, "Parts of it." The rest I'd leave to imagination. One evening, as the last embers glowed, I realized how rare peace felt when you'd fought for it. The trick wasn't revenge, it was endurance. Patience burns slower but lasts longer. Maple Ridge wasn't perfect, but it was ours now. No rulers, no fines, no fear. Just neighbors, just laughter, and the soft crackle of honest firewood. Every now and then, a letter would arrive, addressed to Thomas Thompson, Community Hero, usually from some podcast or online blog wanting an interview about the famous HOA Firewood saga. I ignored them. The internet loves explosions, but it rarely understands what comes after: the rebuilding, the silence, the small acts that stitch life back together. I wasn't a hero. I was a man tired of nonsense who decided to stop flinching. The real story wasn't about gunpowder. It was about boundaries, literal and moral. Karen crossed them all. I just made sure she tripped over one she couldn't rewrite. When people ask me now how to deal with a bully, I tell them, keep your calm, keep your evidence, and never underestimate the power of quiet, well-aimed science. By late summer, peace had become the new rhythm of Maple Ridge. The HOA board met less, smiled more, and people actually volunteered for things again. We built a community garden where the old sign once stood, Karen's old HOA compliance reminder. Now it grew tomatoes instead of tension. Sometimes I'd catch Wilson walking the rows at dusk, clipboard replaced with a watering can, humming to himself. The transformation was quiet but complete. The fear that once clung to every doorstep had been replaced with laughter, porch lights, and the smell of barbecue smoke drifting through open windows. Still, in those still moments before dusk, when the cicadas sang and the air felt heavy with memory, I'd sometimes wonder if Karen ever looked back. Did she regret anything, or just the ending? Autumn rolled in with golden light and the soft crunch of leaves underfoot. The annual Harvest Festival returned, bigger, louder, freer. Kids painted pumpkins, couples danced under string lights, and old Mr. Jenkins read his poetry by the fire pit. I stood near the fire pit, the same one where it all began, watching sparks float up like tiny ghosts of old chaos. People laughed nearby, oblivious to the irony. I'd been called reckless, brilliant, even dangerous, but all I'd ever wanted was peace. I looked at the flames, steady and harmless now, and thought about how control can turn ordinary people cruel. Maybe Karen hadn't been born a villain. Maybe the rules, the power, the constant need to be right had warped her. The fire popped softly, answering for me. Some lessons only come after the smoke clears. Winter crept back quietly, like an old friend who didn't want to intrude. The nights grew longer, colder, and the neighborhood's windows glowed with warm orange light. I spent most evenings in my workshop, tinkering with small projects, a bird feeder here, a wind chime there. Simple things, honest work. One night, Wilson stopped by holding a wrapped box. "For the man who rebuilt this place," he said. Inside was a brass plaque engraved with a single line: "Justice doesn't always wear a badge." I smiled, unsure whether to laugh or sigh. "It's too much," I told him. He shook his head. "Not enough." After he left, I set it on the shelf beside my old camera equipment, the same camera that caught Karen in the act. It felt like balance restored, perfectly measured. A few nights later, snow started falling, thick and slow. I sat by the fire pit again, watching the flakes melt as they touched the heat. The world felt soft, muted. I thought about how small the first spark of conflict had been. One missing log, one ridiculous letter, and how it had ignited something so much larger. Chaos had burned itself out, but what it left behind was clarity. Communities, like fires, need tending. Too much control and they suffocate. Too little and they burn wild. The trick is knowing when to let things breathe. I took a slow sip of coffee. the steam rising like ghosts of the past. Somewhere out there, Karen was probably still fighting her battles. But here in Maple Ridge, the war was over, and the quiet was worth every explosion. One evening, as I walked a snowy street, I saw a moving truck parked outside the old Whitmore house. A young couple stood there laughing, trying to carry a couch too big for the door. "Need a hand?" I asked. And soon we were all inside, maneuvering furniture, swapping names, and sharing stories. When I told them I lived 2 doors down, the wife grinned. "Oh, you're the Firewood guy." I chuckled. "Depends which version you heard." They laughed, and for the first time, even her name didn't sting anymore. It was just history, tucked behind us. By spring, Maple Ridge was thriving. Lawns green again, fences painted bright, and the air alive with the smell of grills and rain. I built a new bench by the garden, engraved a line that made the neighbors chuckle. "No trespassing unless you bring snacks." It became the unofficial gathering spot. People would drop by after work, talking about everything from taxes to TV shows. I realized that peace doesn't mean perfection. It means connection, the kind Karen never understood. She built walls. We built tables. The funny part, I never did replace the last of the hollow logs. They stayed in my shed, collecting dust like old memories. Every time I glanced at them, I thought about how sometimes the smallest spark can burn away years of fear. A dangerous lesson, but a necessary one. Then, one chilly evening, I got a letter. No return address, just my name in neat cursive. Inside was a short note. "I hope you found peace. I'm learning too. K." I stared at it for a long time, the edges trembling between my fingers. It couldn't be anyone else. Karen. No threats, no legal jargon, no venom, just a human voice. I didn't know where she was or what her life looked like now, but for the first time I hoped she'd found something like clarity. I folded the note and tucked it into my workbench drawer, next to the old brass plaque. Maybe redemption doesn't come through apologies. Maybe it comes from the quiet act of trying to be better, even when no one's watching. Either way, it felt like the final ember of an old fire finally dying out. That spring, the neighborhood bloomed brighter than ever before. Kids raced bikes down the cul-de-sac, parents shared lemonade, and the sound of hammers echoed from new projects instead of repairs. I'd sit on my porch some evenings, watching it all, remembering how fragile peace once seemed. Now it was just life, simple, ordinary, perfect. The fire pit in my yard had become a symbol of that. Every time the flames flickered, people gathered, not out of curiosity, but out of warmth. Sometimes Mrs. Beasley would joke, "Careful, Tom, don't light up the HOA again," and I'd grin, tossing another log on the fire. Only if they deserve it. The laughter that followed always felt like victory, not over someone else, but over the fear that once ruled every front yard. As months passed, I noticed something subtle. New families moved in, drawn by the calm reputation Maple Ridge had earned. They didn't know the full story, just whispers about a firewood feud that reshaped the town. To them, this place was peaceful, idyllic, a community that somehow worked. And maybe that was enough. The past didn't need retelling anymore. It had done its job. One evening, as twilight brushed the rooftops, I caught my reflection in the window. Older, maybe a little wiser. The man who once spent nights plotting petty revenge had become a caretaker of calm. I smiled at the thought. Growth, I realized, wasn't about never striking back. It was about knowing when to stop fighting. Because sometimes the loudest kind of justice is silence that stays unbroken. I measured the calm with small rituals, fresh coffee at dawn, the crackle of clean logs, sprinklers hissing along the lane. The street felt wider without tension compressing every porch. Neighbors waved with open shoulders instead of the wary nods we traded under watchful eyes. I kept working in the shed, tuning hinges, oiling tools, sweeping sawdust into neat amber lines. The camera stayed up, not as bait, but as boundary. Quiet sentries that reminded me the yard was mine. Order returned as routine, not threat. Even the group chat softened, gossip replaced by bake sales and lost pet alerts. Relief spread slowly, like warmth through seasoned timber, steady and honest. I told myself the storm had passed, yet habit kept my ears open at night, counting distant engines, testing the air for smoke. Peace was real, but it was also new, and new things need time to hold. I rebuilt the wood stack in tighter courses, bark out, heartwood in, angles aligned like a dry stone wall. Alignment mattered, not for show, but for the feeling of control earned, not imposed. I logged each chord in a little notebook, a craftsman's ledger for a life I intended to keep. The gate got a new latch, no rattle in the wind. The envelope arrived with the noon mail, seal impressed, language stiff with borrowed authority. I read the summons on the porch, sunlight bright across the letterhead, and felt that old pressure tighten behind my ribs. A special hearing, allegations layered like plywood, safety claims, surveillance claims, intent questioned in neat paragraphs. I laid the paper beside my mug and opened the folder I had been building in quiet hours, dates, clips, still frames, the inspection note, snippets from the chat, a slow, patient case. I did not rehearse speeches. I cataloged facts. Orderly work pushed panic to the edges. By evening, the file was heavy with proof you could hold, weight that promised to translate into consequence. In the clubhouse, rows filled, whispers rose, chairs scraped. I took a front seat and slowed my breathing. The fluorescent buzz hummed above the hush, and the podium gleamed with the polish of habitual control. The board settled like jurors who already knew the verdict, but the room had shifted since the smoke. I placed the folder on the table with deliberate care, square to the edge, corners aligned, a small ritual against disorder. Calm. I spoke once, only long enough to fix the frame, then let the record play. Stills on the screen showed heel prints at my gate, the pale bloom of a flashlight, the neat lift of marked oak. Video rolled, night vision grain stitching movement to intent, license numerals glinting like admission. The inspection note followed, precise language tracing small combustion to the hearth that hosted stolen fuel. Murmur grew into a tide that pressed against the podium and washed the pretense from familiar faces. The bylaws came next, not as weapons, but as lines meant to guard the many from the one. A motion rose, simple and clean, and hands lifted in a wave that felt like air after rain. The gavel struck wood, and authority relocated to the room. The breath I had been holding for months left without ceremony, and the knot I'd carried reduced to a thread I could finally sever. I walked out under the same fluorescent hum, but it sounded thinner, stripped of its edge. On the sidewalk, night air moved through maple crowns, a low rustle that sounded like agreement. I went home the way past porches that felt lit, past driveways no longer arranged for inspection, past my own gate that answered with a click. Morning light found me earlier than usual, pale and cold across the deck boards. The air smelled of rain turned to steel. I brewed coffee, slow and methodical, the way routine becomes therapy after chaos. The meeting was done, signatures sealed, consequences recorded. Power had changed direction, quietly, like groundwater shifting beneath the surface. I watched condensation bloom on the kitchen window and thought about weight, how rules had carried too much of it for too long, pressing the breath from every simple act. Now the balance had recalibrated. Lawns no longer looked like evidence. Mailboxes were just metal again, not symbols. The hum of mowers replaced the shrill tone of reprimand. I poured a second cup and sat outside, bare feet on cold wood, feeling the neighborhood stretch. Peace wasn't dramatic. It crept in sideways, patient and unannounced. The kind that teaches you control is useless without trust. Even the wind seemed slower. Days became weeks, the steady rhythm of normal life repairing what fear had splintered. The board met again, but now their minutes read like gratitude instead of warnings. The word violation vanished from the memos, replaced by improvement and volunteer. I spent afternoons fixing benches by the pond, tools humming in the quiet. Sometimes kids wandered over to skip stones, laughter ringing against the water. It struck me how sound could mark recovery better than silence ever could. In the evenings, porch lights glowed like low stars, steady, equal. I'd lean back in my chair, listening to sprinklers hiss along the lane, each arc a reminder that order could exist without fear. The old notices still sat in a drawer, faded and curling, relics of a war fought with paper. I kept them not as trophies, but proof of evolution. The neighborhood had learned what fire taught best. Some structures need to burn before they can stand straight again. Autumn drifted in soft as dust, gold and smoke in the air, and the memory of that night had become folklore told with half smiles. The phrase "firewood justice" found its way into local gossip, softened into legend, stripped of heat. People forgot the fear, kept the lesson. The new president sent out a newsletter that began with gratitude instead of citations. I read it twice, amused by how sincerity felt revolutionary. The woodpile behind my shed was smaller now, reduced to what I needed, stacked tight, seasoned honest. I touched each log like checking a heartbeat, remembering how intention once held the power to spark chaos. Now it was just wood again, harmless, ready to serve warmth instead of retribution. I built a small bench beside it from leftover planks, initials carved in the corner. Mine, and the date everything changed. It wasn't pride, exactly, more like closure, shaped in grain and ash. Winter returned with its quiet authority, the kind that makes even sound hesitate. The chimneys breathed again, this time without drama, just the steady exhale of ordinary life. I'd split a few logs every morning, not from need, but from ritual. The swing of the axe was rhythm, the thud of the blade against wood a reminder of control reclaimed. The scent of pine and frost filled the yard. Every now and then I'd spot a car slowing near the old Whitmore house, drivers curious about the story whispered online, but the place was just another home now, its scars buried under paint and laughter. The new family there had planted maples in the front yard, and each season they grew taller, straight, and unapologetic. The neighborhood had found balance, and maybe so had I. The fire that once defined us had finally learned how to warm instead of destroy. By early spring, the rhythm of Maple Ridge felt unshakable. Children played without glancing over their shoulders, and porch lights glowed for welcome, not warning. Evenings were slower, filled with small talk about gardens, school projects, and recipes instead of rules and fines. I had become something like a caretaker, though nobody called it that. People brought over pies, shared tools, borrowed ladders. We became a real community again, messy, kind, imperfect. Sometimes I'd sit by the fire pit and trace the grain of an old hollow log, one of the few I'd kept hidden behind the shed. It was cracked now, fragile from time. I never burned it. It served as a relic, proof that justice could be crafted by hand when reason fails. The flame that once roared now whispered quietly in its place, steady and small, like trust rebuilt one ember at a time. One morning, a letter came from the county office, a notice about the HOA's dissolution becoming official. I read it twice, then folded it neatly and slid it into the back of my notebook. The thing that once ruled our lives now existed only as paperwork. Freedom doesn't announce itself. It settles into your bones like a slow sunrise. That afternoon, I walked through the neighborhood, nodding to faces that used to hide behind blinds. Laughter carried through open windows, and for a moment, the air itself felt lighter. I realized we'd built something stronger than rules, accountability. Not through fear, but through memory. Every nail hammered, every smile exchanged, was a silent promise not to let things slip back. The system had fallen, but the people had learned to stand taller. It was fragile, but so is every good thing worth keeping. By summer, the story of the explosion had become something between myth and moral tale. New neighbors heard fragments: the man with the booby-trapped firewood, the president who learned humility the hard way, and laughed over barbecues, not realizing how deep those scars once ran. I didn't correct them. Some stories lose power when told too clearly. I preferred it this way. Truth wrapped in rumor, serving its purpose quietly. The nights grew longer, warm and forgiving. I'd sit outside with a beer, the fire pit flickering low, watching sparks drift toward the stars. The noise of crickets filled the gaps where fear used to live. I wasn't a hero. I was just a man who had gotten tired of being afraid in his own yard. And somehow, that had been enough to change everything. One evening, as twilight stretched across the street, I walked past the old HOA office, now an empty rental, its blinds drawn. The sign out front still read Community Hall, but the paint was peeling and weeds had cracked the pavement. I stood there for a while, listening to the hum of insects and the distant laughter from the cul-de-sac. Power decays quietly, I thought, like wood left too long in the rain. It doesn't crumble all at once, it softens first. The building smelled of dust and nostalgia, and I realized I wasn't angry anymore. Anger was a spark, necessary once, but unsustainable. What had replaced it was quieter, a kind of peace you don't notice until you exhale and realize you'd been holding your breath for years. I turned away, the sound of cicadas chasing me home. Life folded back into small, good things. Morning walks, the creak of my gate, the rhythm of sprinklers on Sunday mornings. The neighborhood felt alive again, breathing in unison. I started teaching the kids basic woodworking, showing them how to sand, how to read the grain. They called it Firewood class, half joking, half awed. It became our tradition. Every fall, we built something new, a birdhouse, a bench, a planter box, and burned the scraps together as the sky turned orange. Watching their faces glow in the firelight, I saw what restoration really meant. Not punishment, not revenge, but continuity. Something living, built from what had burned. The flames danced soft and harmless now, echoing laughter instead of screams. I leaned back, feeling the heat brush my hands, and knew this was how peace was supposed to look. Autumn came again, slower this time, like a song replayed softer than before. The trees around Maple Ridge shimmered in amber light, each leaf holding a small echo of everything we'd survived. I rebuilt the fence along the back lot, not because it was broken, but because creation steadies the hands that once shook with anger. The air smelled of sawdust and calm. Neighbors stopped by to offer help, but I told them it was fine. I wanted to finish it alone. The fence wasn't about keeping anyone out anymore. It was about marking what had been restored. Ownership, not of land, but of peace. As I drove the last nail, I looked up and caught the reflection of sunlight off the old camera lens above the shed. It was still there, forgotten but faithful, a relic of a war I no longer needed to fight. I left it in place anyway, not as defense, but as memory. The nights cooled quickly, and fires returned to the pits and chimneys across the block. This time, the smoke carried laughter, not accusations. I'd sit outside with a blanket, watching the glow spread through the neighborhood like a slow heartbeat. The old stories lived on in fragments, half warning, half legend. But they belonged to everyone now, not just me. The lesson had outgrown the man. Sometimes I'd think about her, not with hate, but with that quiet understanding that time gives to once fierce enemies. Somewhere out there, she was probably still fighting something she couldn't name. I wished her peace, in the only way I knew, by not thinking of her too often. Forgiveness isn't loud. It's the silence that comes when the fire finally burns clean. The new board built a garden where the HOA sign used to stand, a circle of stone with a single oak sapling in the center. They called it the community grove, but everyone just said the peace tree. On weekends, kids chased each other between the benches, and the air was thick with grill smoke and cut grass. I'd walk by sometimes, hands in my pockets, smiling at how something so simple could replace something once so oppressive. Maybe that was justice too, the quiet kind that doesn't need witnesses. I stopped by one afternoon, placed a small carving at the base of the tree. A wooden matchstick, sanded smooth, unlit. A symbol of restraint, not revenge. It felt right to leave it there. A reminder that even fire has its season, and that control, when earned, can coexist with kindness. The following winter was the calmest we'd ever had. No letters, no citations, just the soft weight of snow over rooftops and fences. I spent the cold evenings by my fire pit again. The flame, small, steady, alive. The crackle of burning oak no longer reminded me of conflict. It sounded like conversation, the kind you have with yourself after the noise has faded. Each spark that leapt upward carried some fragment of the past, dissolved in smoke before reaching the dark sky. People still mentioned the explosion sometimes, but they said it now with a smile, like a fable that had done its work. I'd nod and let them tell it their way. Truth doesn't mind distortion once its purpose is fulfilled. Some stories need to survive as myths. They burn longer that way. Spring returned, bright and unapologetic. The grove had grown taller, roots gripping the soil like it finally trusted the ground. The neighborhood held its first festival. Music, banners, laughter echoing through streets once ruled by whispers. I stood by the food table, flipping burgers, the same spot where it all began. Someone clapped me on the shoulder, called me the man who started the change, and I laughed, shaking my head. Change doesn't start with heroes, it starts with limits, with the moment you stop tolerating the small wrongs because they grow into walls. The firewood taught me that. Not every flame destroys. Some purify. And in that slow burn, something new emerges. Lighter, stronger, honest. As dusk settled, I looked around at the faces glowing in lantern light and realized I didn't just belong here. I was part of it. Years blurred softly after that, blending into a peace I'd once thought impossible. Maple Ridge became what it was always meant to be, a place of people, not power. The woodpile behind my shed stood smaller each season, but every cut log still felt like a heartbeat. The marks I'd carved years ago had faded, and I liked it that way. Scars, too, are meant to fade. I walked the street one last time before sunset, the air gold and clean. The wind moved through the trees with the same low whisper that had once carried anger, now softened into contentment. I stopped at the gate, ran my hand over its grain, and smiled. Fire had taught me everything I needed to know, what to build, what to burn, and when to simply let things cool. There's a fine line between order and obsession. Cross it, and even good intentions catch fire. I learned that control without compassion turns to smoke, while justice without mercy leaves only ash. But somewhere between those, there's balance, the quiet kind that doesn't seek to win, only to restore. That's what Maple Ridge found. That's what I found. The neighborhood sleeps easy now, and sometimes, when the night's still enough, I can almost hear the soft pop of distant embers, like memory refusing to die completely. I raise a glass to the sound, to the lesson, to the symmetry of cause and consequence. Maybe one day the story will fade entirely, swallowed by new laughter, new lives. But as long as there's fire in this world, there will be people who test it and people who remember to respect it. I lean back, watching sparks climb into the night. They drift higher, smaller, fading into stars. And I whisper to no one in particular, to peace, to fire, to endings that finally stay quiet.